I'd like to just start by thanking those who have turned out here this evening. And history is always a very important part of our lives. And knowing what we're about, where we come from, helps us to move forward in a little bit of a better way. And it brings us a better understanding and appreciation for one another. When I went to university, I did, of course, a lot of reading, and many of my course subjects were in the area of history and anthropology. So I studied many different cultures, and it's enabled me to broaden my own horizons to appreciate other cultures around the world. And of course, in the process, rubbed shoulders with many of my colleagues in the classrooms, and got to know quite a few of them. I'd like to start just by stating that the Friendship Center in Edmonton, it's been a catalyst for a lot of things in the past. The development of so much. And that is really one of the things that we can credit the Friendship Center movement for. The centers grew up in Canada in a period of time where there was a lot of unrest, socially particularly. Our people, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit, were experiencing some pretty tough times back in the 50s and 60s, just when the centers were firing up. And the first center to develop was in Winnipeg, 10 miles away from where I lived, and that was in 1959. In 1960, Vancouver. 1961, Regina. 1962, here. So this was the fourth of what came to be 108 Friendship Centers across the country. So it was an early bird. And 2 years after here was when Calgary started up, 1964. And it was the following year, 65, that I got involved with the Friendship Center movement and never left it. So I've had a pretty long-standing relationship and understand the workings, the different parameters involved in the movement. The center in Edmonton developed at a time when the Aboriginal community was in a new and exciting time period. It was the era of the hippie movement, complete with bell-bottom trousers, peace symbols, long hair, what have you. It was an exciting time. There was a lot of good music going on, but it was also a time of social unrest. It was a time of the Black Power movement, particularly in the United States, although there were branches up here. It was also a time of AIM, the American Indian movement, going on. And there was a smattering of that existed right here in Edmonton. And in fact, some of the members used to frequent the Friendship Centers. Now, the forerunner of the Friendship Center was actually a small group. There was a small core group that founded the Friendship Center movement. And there were several of them that were involved, and they used to meet at the home of Mrs. J.D. Sturrock up on 111th Avenue, east of the downtown area. And a key player along with her in this startup was Eddie Belrose, who went on to become a very respected elder and highly involved also with some other things, Native communications and so on. And Eddie was he turned out to become the first vice president for the Friendship Center Society. But the center itself was, which started in '62, was preceded in 1960 by the Canadian Native Society. Okay. And it was that group of several individuals who used to meet and plan for the development of what was to become the Friendship Center. There were various reasons for this operation. One of them especially was the fact that there was, when we get into the 1960s, you have a much higher movement of Aboriginal people from the reserves, and from the Métis settlements, and also from other cities, migrating here to the point of where there was not just hundreds and thousands of them, but tens of thousands. In the last estimates that were put forward, the figures would range anywhere from 40 to 60,000 Aboriginals in the city. That, of course, created a lot of pressure on the cities to accommodate the needs of the Aboriginal people. Many came here from very humble beginnings. Many came from poor families, by and large. They came from areas where educational services were not the best. They did not have the best of teachers, because the good teachers would stay in the larger communities and centers. And some of them, for example, were never privy even to certain subjects in the schools that the general population was. So this was going to, of course, turn out to be a real detriment to our Native people here in Edmonton. Because if you don't have the proper education, you're not going to get the good jobs. The ones that pay, sufficiently, or what we could say adequately. And many people had low incomes. If you have low incomes, usually your standard of health is lower, your status out in the community is generally lower, and discrimination is also something that seeps in with that. Because so many people back in those days used to frown upon people who were not well educated, who were not well off. And this is a situation that the Friendship Center movement wanted to turn around. They wanted to help the individuals who were moving into the city in various ways. So they started up a whole raft of different programs, and they had to start at first with on a real shoestring, believe me. They only had, I remember when the center here first started, all they had at their office was one chair, one table. That was it. They had no budget. Their rent, back then, 1962 we're talking about, their rent, they got a house from the city. And for that house, the rent was $200 a month. Now, of course, you have to put that into context, because we're talking about 1960, not 2015. The core group of individuals went around scrounging some initial capital. They didn't really get enough to supply staff, so there was a lot of dependence on volunteers to assist the center. People who weren't working were encouraged to help the center in its duties. Some of the key issues from the outset of the Friendship Center particularly, one was that of alcoholism. Because many of our people that came to the cities having nothing to do, and when you've got free time on your hands, you usually fall into that trap of frequenting the bars, the cafes, the train stations, the bus depots. And there were problems with that too. Because if there was sickness going on, whether it was TB, whether it was a simple thing like the flu or anything like that, those were the places they'd be transferred. The other thing that was really bad about some of those, a huge negative, was the scamming and the exploitation that would occur in those places. There were many people who used to frequent the train stations and bus depots just to pick up our women and to either exploit them as street people or to get them dependent on drugs, which they would supply and, of course, expect favors in return. So, Phil Thompson, who was a slavey Indian from way up north, Assumption, Alberta, so outside of high level, was hired on as the first director of the Friendship Center. So this would have been in the early 60s. He had a very good education behind him. He had also been a flight lieutenant in the Air Force. Even after he left the Friendship Center as a staff member, he traveled to many different places, Obima, Enoch, where he took on major roles. I remember one time meeting him in Calgary when I was working with the Calgary Herald. And he came into the building, we ran into each other. And I asked him what he's doing there, and he says, well, he says, our band, which I'm working for as the band manager, he says, we got a major check. And, you know, back in those days, he let me hold it. And I was just shaking. It was 250 grand, you know, $250,000. And back around 1970, that, you know, that was a lot of money. I didn't even give it second thought in terms of like, just run away and take off with it. I thought about that later on and I thought, gee, maybe I should have. If I'd have done that, I probably wouldn't be here today. I'd still be stewing in a prison cell. But no, Phil was a real nice guy, and he was very dedicated and devoted to any job that he undertook. And he was one heck of a man for the Friendship Center to start off their programming with. He attended to first things first. He knew that alcoholism was a huge problem for our people back in those days. He also knew that the center would never ever survive if it didn't really get off the ground, and particularly in terms of finances. So he went around, he did speaking engagements with clubs, service clubs, organizations, government people, and so on. And within a short time, he had commitments, as many as like 36 commitments for people that were willing to help. And they put up the dollars to maintain the Friendship Center. The Independent Order of Daughters was one that really helped a lot. The Hobima 4 bands helped quite a bit. I remember they gave an initial $1,000 to the Friendship Center here. The Mennonite Church gave $100. Enoch gave $100 in those early times. And I'm speaking of the period like between 1962 and 65. Those were the dawning years, the years in which the center was struggling and coping to, you know, get themselves off the ground, stabilized, and get some staff people. And little by little, it happened. It was a gradual process, certainly, but one that they came to be quite proud of by the time 1970 rolled around. And by the time they hit the period of the 70s, they were really moving. They had a lot of programs operating. I'll just give you a rundown of some of them. For example, this is from the mid-60s, 65 and 6. The membership was helped in the areas employment, 127 people during that 1 year, accommodations, 55 families, clothing, 42 families, food and aid, 80 families, welfare, 72 families, education, educational tutoring, 20 students, court cases, 324, court appearances, 269. And that again ties in with what I was saying earlier about when people are coming in and they're not well off. That's what often happens. You fall in to the scene of crime and or alcohol or drugs. Emergency trips, 249. Emergency meals in bed, 347. Referrals, 652. And last but not least, of course, the never-ending telephone calls, 10,000 plus. So, but the centers over time took shifts in their direction. So for example, alcoholism, which was a huge problem back in the 60s and 70s, lessened as the years went by. People started attending AA. In fact, the center started its own program that was, it was built on the design of the AA movement. And it was called the Tuau group. Tuau meaning welcome. So it was their own version. It was the center's own version of AA. And people would go to that rather than go to the AA because there was better understanding of just where our people come from and what they've always had to deal with. And in that Tuau group, we had our own people serving the needs of our people, and because of that, there was a better relationship that existed, and the chances of turning your life around from alcoholism was heightened all the more, and it proved itself to happen. And over time, of course, people involved in the Friendship Center movement moved on. What I said earlier about the Friendship Center being a catalyst, that was one of the things that was so positive about the center, because it set the stage, if you will, for the development of these other bodies, these other groups and organizations to spring forward. Native housing through Native housing, Native outreach for Native employment services, Native counseling services of Alberta to deal with court and legal matters and provide legal advice to our people. Sometimes lawyers and business people would be brought in and deliver lectures to the membership to help them better understand what it is they're involved with in city life here. The list goes on and on in terms of programs that operated through the Friendship Center. Right now, for example, there's far less that is happening in the area of sports and recreation because of the absence of proper facilities. In 2010, the Friendship Center here sold its building for reasons that they put forward, such as overhead costs being far too high to continue maintaining the building in a fashion where the center, they said the center was going to go broke if they continued to stay in that building. The old church was what they called the People's Church in his day. So that was in 2010. Since 2010, that's 5 years now, close to 6. And throughout that time, it has not yet had a good alternate from which to operate. They've been in 2 different spaces that they've rented. The first one was very small, was in the old offices in the West End that had been occupied by the native newspaper, Windspeaker and Sweetgrass. And space there was extremely limited. Now they're on 95th Street between 117th and 118th Avenue, next door to the Métis Regional Office, and that building also has its limitations. Okay? So the main floor is mainly some office space, a small meeting room that doubles for their board meetings, and then they've got an open area upstairs, maybe kind of about the size of this room. So you can appreciate that they can't really host programs that they had before, whether those were sports or social activities. The center was notorious for hosting round dances, sports tournaments, volleyball, basketball, floor hockey. In the previous years, the 70s and 80s, they used to also have a boxing ring. In fact, one of the special visitors when they had the boxing ring going was none other than former world champion Joe Frazier. And of course, all the Canadians were the Canadian boxers of note. Many of them dropped into the center from time to time. When Willie DeWitt, who became Canadian champion, a fellow from Grand Prairie, when he was here in the city, he used to work out at the Friendship Center gym when he was 17 years old. And he used to pack rocks on his back to toughen up his muscles, his back muscles, his legs. But Gordon Russell started with the Friendship Center in 1972. And he was a fellow that was going to help bring many of our young Native athletes to rise and shine. There were guys like Guy Boutin, who went on to become a Canadian champion, Randy Jackson, and another one was a Pruden boy. And 2 of those 3, all of them were Golden Gloves champions, but 2 of them also became Canadian champions in their weight classes. One was a bantamweight, and I can't remember the other one, but they did well under the tutelage of Gordon Russell. So Gordon Russell became something of an icon in circles. In fact, his boxing club, called the Native Boys Boxing Club, was known all across this country because of the talent that he brought out with our young Native lads. But Gordon instructed more than just boxing. He did a lot in the way of these kids feeling good about themselves, having a good self-image. And that's so critical with our young people as they grow up. And that's just another thing that I've always really appreciated in the Friendship Center movement, is their focus on the youth. Because those are the people that are going to be out there making decisions, some of which could affect our own futures. So it's important for them to grow up as good, strong individuals with good ethics, integrity, honesty, respectful, all the different things that sports development employs with their clientele. And anybody who's doing a job of managing and or coaching in the area of sports knows that for a fact. The centers were fortunate that while they were still young, including the one here, they were recognized by the various government bodies, all three levels, civic, provincial, federal. So they got some of their funding through all three levels, and the department that initially provided finances for the Friendship Center movement here was the Secretary of State. Over time, that changed, because the government now has a minister that's responsible for things such as sports and recreation and health and wellness. So falls in those categories as well. But it's been a real, it's been a real roller coaster. And the center is just like any other organization. It has its ups and downs. It has its roller coaster rides, And there are times when I know, like I say, I myself have been involved directly as a staff member, as a board member, and as a volunteer with the Friendship Center movements since the mid-60s. And it never fails at some time, at some point, you're going to have infighting going on. People who are vying for positions on the board, people who are vying for positions on staff, people who want certain favors from the Friendship Center. Like, I could go on and on telling you stories about individuals who have scammed the Friendship Center movement, taken advantage of their positions from within for the good of themselves rather than the good of the people that the center is supposed to be serving, and that's pretty sad. I remember one instance where we had several deer hides come in. They were already tanned and they were beautiful. And one of the people that intervened and took possession of those hides when they had no right to, and took them home and was going to use them for themselves, for making of crafts. Oh man, I mean, who does that impact? It's the kids that suffer that loss of those materials. So because those hides were gone, the youth weren't able to learn the craft making that those were intended for. And this person was in a very high position at the Friendship Center, but I went after that individual. It took me quite a while, but I finally got those hides returned. And you know, I didn't care whether they hated me for it or not, because to me I was just doing what I should be doing, righting the wrong. And it's just unfortunate that, but we have bad people in all societies. It doesn't matter which culture we come from, you know, you're always going to run across them. But when you know that you are in the right, never be afraid to confront an issue like that, because what can they do to you, especially when they know that you're right? They'll already be, you know, feeling themselves the guilt of what they did because they know that they were wrong. You know? So I'm not saying corruption is rampant in the Friendship Center movement, no, but I'm saying sometimes these things happen. That's to be expected, and you deal with it as you can. But at any rate, the centers here had a pretty glorious time. Clarence Phillips, Clarence Longmore, Gordon Russell, and then some other people, they were on staff, okay? And they really helped the Friendship Center sports program move along. Oh, one other, and he's still with us today, Lloyd Auger. His health is not the greatest, but he too used to coach some of the sports teams. The teams did very well. Even Willie Littlechild, who became Member of Parliament and one of the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation, Willie attended university here, and while he did that, he used to frequent the Friendship Center as well. And he got a hockey team started up that did pretty good. There were some of these ladies, the girls and the boys basketball team, not so much basketball, but volleyball and baseball. They did really well. The male baseball team went right to the interprovincial championships as finalists. The girls, 1981, 82, 85, won the National Indian Athletic Association championships. So that was a real feather in the cap of the Friendship Center here to do that. I remember this one gal, she was involved with us on our board when we started up the movement that created the North American Indigenous Games in 1990 and is still running today. This one gal, she was from the Métis settlement east of here. And I'll tell you, that gal, I would never have wanted to wrestle with her, even arm wrestle. She was like just solid, you know? You talk about being like a 2x4 or a 4x4. She had it all. She had the power and the strength. And she had the personality that went with it too. Very, very nice individual. But There were a lot of people in sports that turned out to be very good, personable individuals. Many of them gave back to the Friendship Center after their years were done in the area of sports by volunteering their services. I remember, for example, 1987, there was a young man, well, he wasn't so young, I guess by my standards he was young. He was in his 40s. And he did a run, a marathon from here, starting off from Fort Edmonton Park, all the way to New York City to retrieve, or to attempt to retrieve, a sacred First Nations object from the museum there. And as a youngster, he used to box, and he himself had been a Golden Gloves champion. And that fella, I really felt for him because, you know, but at least he made the effort. That run all the way to New York City, which they did in stages, and through the most trying time of the year, winter, you know, because they took off in the fall and they arrived in New York in the spring. So there was a lot of cold days on that run. And can you just imagine him tripping through places like Manitoba and Ontario, which has some pretty cold winters, you know? And I know, trying to remember the name, Billy Mills, the Olympian, the first American to win the 10,000 meters, a native boy. I remember asking him if he would help us out with that run by contributing whatever he could. And so what he arranged for was some of the footwear, the running shoes that the boys needed. Because this fella that made the run, Jim Thunder was his name. The late Jim Thunder passed away here a few years ago. He was not the only one that made the run. There was, at any given time, there was usually 4 runners, and they would work in relays on that run. But they did run all the way. So it was nice that Billy Mills was able to help out in that manner. And when Jim eventually got back to Alberta here, he took up the gloves again, mind you, not as a competitor, but as an instructor, okay? And he mentored our young kids at the last large Friendship Center that we had here, which was on 101st Street and 112th Avenue. Just mentioning the buildings of the Friendship Center, the very first building, that house that the center rented in 1962, which was the year that the Friendship Center formed, that house they rented from the city was at 10218 108th Street. Oh, those of you that know Edmonton can just picture that area. You know where that sits, eh? That's right across the street from present-day Northwest College. There used to be, it's no longer there, there used to be a car wash on that northwest corner of that intersection, 102nd Avenue and 108th Street. And that's where this two-story clapboard building was that the center first rented. That was their first home. And that was the thing that troubled the people that originated the Friendship Center movement also in the early going, was how come all these other ethnic groups in the city, you know, the German Canadians, the Ukrainian Canadians, the Chinese Canadians, all these different ethnic groups, they all had their own community halls or structures, whatever they were, and yet there was nothing for our Aboriginal community. So, and that was why they banded together and decided to do something. Well, that, and of course the ultimate objective, which was to help meet the needs of the urban people living in and migrating to the city of Edmonton. And we had individuals, another guy that boxed, he was a northerner from the Arctic actually, and some of you might remember his name because he also sat on city council. This fellow went by the name of Dave Ward. Okay? He was an Inuit. He was a lawyer, one of the early batches of Aboriginal lawyers in this country. So we had people like that who associated themselves quite a lot with the Friendship Center movement and went on to things like city council, among other things. We have many, many people now who go through the Friendship Centers who are in higher education, getting not just a bachelor's degree, but master's and PhDs. You wouldn't believe the number who are now going in for their doctorates. There's quite a few. And when the center first took root in the early stages in the 60s too, that was one of the other things that they did, was they helped tutor some of the students who really needed it. You know, that was a time when we talk about the 60s and 70s, we didn't have a lot of people, never mind college or university, we didn't have that many people who were even finishing grade school. Most of our people back in those days, if they were fortunate enough, got a grade 7 or 8 education. There were many, including Stan Daniels, who became the provincial Métis Association president for a number of years. He only had around a grade 4 education. I remember when I lived in Winnipeg, the mayor there for 25 years, Stephen Juba, he only had a grade 3 education, you know. But that's a pat on the back for them, for sure. But it shows you what people can do when they set their mind to it. And that education isn't always the wherewithal for success in a career. The center movement, there's one part of business that also warrants a bit of a pat on the back for them, and that's the whole thing of reporting. Because for a lot of organizations, whether they're native or otherwise, one of the weaknesses of so many organizations has been their failure to report or to adequately report at the end of their fiscal years. And particularly accountability for their funding. But it's an area that the center has always had a pretty good focus. So that seldom was there really anything in the way of rip-offs of the center from within. And that kind of goes to their credit in terms of, I know that the late Donna Woodward, who was for many years the financial controller of the Friendship Center here, that gal, she just did a amazing job. And it was people like her who helped keep the Friendship Center alive, because again, what organization is going to stay on its feet if they don't have funding? And the Métis Association, as an example of today also, has been keeping very stable financially, because the person that's been in the position of president now for over 10 years was formerly their financial controller, So she knew all the hoops to jump through to get funding and to also account for their expenditures. And so it was with the Friendship Center movement, just like the Métis Association, because Donna Woodward knew what it was all about and knew how to do it properly and keep transparent and be accountable for those dollars and cents. The center continues to be funded through the federal government, and kind of indirectly in a way. So the funding today flows, the centers in Alberta get their approval from the provincial Friendship Center office, who in turn receives theirs from the National Friendship Center Association. Okay, so it's no longer a case, as it was in the early days, where funding flowed from Secretary of State directly to your Friendship Center. So that's really changed over the years. And I mean, who knows whether it's going to remain that way? Who knows whether government itself will continue to fund Friendship Centers? And I think the day that, if and when it arrives, that they discontinue, I think that will be a sad day. Unless the centers are able to put in place programming that will see them become self-sufficient. And there are some ways that that could be done. I'm not going to explore those here and now, not today, but it's certainly food for thought, I would think, for the friendship centers. And I know that through my own experience at the board level, because I sat for a number of years here on the executive committee, usually as the vice president or the secretary of the board for the Friendship Center here. And some of us have discussed the possibility of that happening someday, and that we should be giving it perhaps some thought, how we could counter, the loss of that kind of income. Because what are you going to do then if it all of a sudden falls in your lap? So I really think it is something that Friendship Center should give thought to, a little more than they have. You get caught up sometimes too in the politics of things. I know there was a period here with the Friendship Center where there was an overabundance of concentration on governance, and it's fine and dandy, but you can't beat a lot of the old traditional values of organizational operations in a traditional fashion. Even simple things like, and some of the centers are taking this on nowadays, the whole thing of decision-making through consensus rather than voting. Just going by general consensus. Don't have to go through all the stuff of raising hands or passing out slips of paper all the time for people to vote yay or nay or abstain, whichever. As for membership, at any given time, the Friendship Center membership list usually hovers anywhere from 300, roughly 300 to 450. That might not seem an awful lot in terms of the population figure, but I wonder what it would be with many of the other ethnic organizations in this city. I don't think they do too badly.